Minnie Ingersoll, who is a principal in business operations at Google, where she's a member of the Access team, which combines policy with technology. She has her bachelor's in computer science from Stanford and her MBA from Harvard, and she will direct this exciting group.
Thank you. And thanks for having us here. So what we keep hearing about since this wave of freedom has been sweeping the Arab world, global headlines everywhere have been talking about how social media has been responsible for organizing the protests, rallying demonstrators, how it's social media has helped to play a part in the overthrow of dictators. In Tunisia, we heard about the Twitter revolution, and soon thereafter, what we saw in Egypt, people talked about the Facebook revolution. As mentioned, I work at Google, of course, so we think Google played some role there as well. And we have a wonderful panel here who's going to talk about what really happened, some of their experiences mobilizing people on Facebook, Twitter, how they've seen technology work. We're going to talk about some questions of how do you set up a campaign? How do you actually get followers? Dr. Rice talked about the Ceausescu moment, and what's the equivalent online, and how do these tools really work? What sort of research is possible? What sort of research has been done to look at how people interact online and how that translates into offline movement, how offline work and organizations appear online. So let me introduce our panelists. We have Philip Howard, the director of the Project on Information Technology and Political Islam at the University of Washington. Oscar Morales, visiting fellow in human freedom at the George W. Bush Institute. Ian Schuler, senior program manager, Internet Freedom Programs at the U.S. Department of State. And we've got Maajid Nawaz on my left, co-founder and director of the Quilliam Foundation and the founder of Coodie. So at this panel, I'll ask a few questions, and then there'll be some time afterwards. We'll have a discussion. There'll be some time afterwards for all of you to ask some questions as well. So we're going to start with Philip Howard, who is currently doing research. Philip, I'm going to ask if you'd like to take the podium to feel free and just to tell us something about the research you've been doing.
Thank you. Thank you, Minnie. Thank you for the invitation to speak. As Minnie mentioned, I direct a project on information technology and political Islam. And in September 2010, we published a book, The Digital Origins of Democracy, that was actually a 15-year study of what I think of as a fairly long-term trend. This is a study from 1995 to 2010 about many of the important political transitions that have occurred in countries with very significant, in terms of size, very significant Muslim communities. And we found two things in the book. First, we found that digital media has become very important for young democracies in helping them get better at doing democratic things. And this theory involves cases, some of which were discussed earlier this morning, Malaysia and Indonesia, and Turkey, to some degree Bangladesh. These are countries where political competition has become more intense, but some of the radical voices that we see sometimes online use digital media to compete for votes. And they end up, over the last decade or so, they end up being content with 10, 20% of the popular vote. So digital media in some of these young democracies has been a way of integrating voices, new voices, and sometimes radical voices, into a stable form of democratic interaction. The second thing we found in the book is that there are some key moments where digital media is a very important tool for civil society actors. These are political groups that are not affiliated with the state. And digital media, it turns out, is very difficult for states to control. So with these two findings in mind, we began some conversations here with the George W. Bush Institute. And the Institute supported some new research over the last month, and that's what I'd like to highlight for you today. So the numbers I'm presenting will be released in a couple of weeks in a longer report. What I'm going to offer is some of our initial findings to get at this question of what really happened over the last month and a half. And there's three important trend lines I want to discuss. The first is that in our study of the Tunisian blogosphere, it's pretty clear that political conversations, online conversations, critiques of governance, and street action evolved together. So let me explain what I mean by this. Between November and December and the early part of January, we found that between 3 and 5% of Tunisian blogs were having very active political conversation about Ben Ali's leadership. In the second week of January, there were some interesting trends in who was talking about what. We were tracking keywords such as liberty and revolution, economy, the names of key political figures, and Islam, to see where these topics were fitting in the online conversation. November, December, first part of January, between 3 and 5% of the blog posts concerned Ben Ali's leadership. By the time Ben Ali was forced to resign in mid-January, fully 1/5 of all Tunisian blogs were discussing his leadership, up from 5% in the first week. And when his replacement took power, his replacement was closely associated with with the ruling elites of the country. When his replacement took power, there were key spikes in the use of the word revolution and liberty. These two terms became some of the most consistent words used by Tunisians bloggers to discuss what was going on in their political lives. By the third week of January, 18% of all blog posts contained references to revolution. 1 in 10 discussed made references to liberty. That week, the week in which liberty and revolution peaked as topics of interest, the estimates of protester turnout on the streets ranged between 40,000 and 100,000 people. Subsequently, the primary topic of political conversation in Tunisia specifically became revolution, until a public rally of at least 100,000 people on February 27th, at which point Ghannouchi was forced to resign. Now, through this trajectory, this upturn in interest in political change and liberty specifically, we noticed two things. The topic of economic woes for the country stayed consistent but minor, as did political conversations about Islam. And one of the things we know from reports from the street is that Islam, religious fundamentalism, was not an important part of the motivation for turnout in the early days of rebellion, of uprising in Tunisia. And it didn't figure well prominently in the blogosphere either. So revolution and liberty became the keywords for that moment in the 48 hours before major turnouts in the streets of Tunis. The second thing we found in our research is that social media use brought a cascade or wave of high expectations for political opportunity from country to country to country. On average, throughout our study period, we were able to locate actually which Twitter users were in country and which ones were out of country. One of the debates we're having amongst people who study these trends is whether it's possible to actually figure out which Twitter users are in country. We were able to do that. And 18% of the people tweeting about the Tunisian uprising were definitely in Tunisia. The day that Ben Ali resigned, 2,200 people in other countries tweeted about his resignation. This includes Algeria, Bahrain, Egypt, Morocco, and Yemen. Twitter users in these countries were frantically tweeting about the events in their neighboring country. As domestic and international pressure for Mubarak to resign also built, some 3,000 people in the region were tweeting about change. Now, what we were able to do in our research was separate out people in countries tweeting about opportunities in their own country and those tweeting across the region. So, the experience of Tunisian became a digital story that cascaded from country to country. The experience of political uprising in Egypt became a digital story that then cascaded from country to country. The day he resigned, 250,000 people in the region tweeted about the event. And with expectations running high among civil society actors and civil society groups in the region, there were 3,500 tweets a day about the possibilities and prospects for political change in the region by people in the region. The third thing I'd like to highlight from our preliminary research is that Facebook and Western media has been consistently central in most structures of online political conversation in Egypt. Now, let me explain what I mean by this. My group did what we call a link analysis to see which political websites and which bloggers were linking to each other in November 2010. With support from the Institute, we repeated the exercise in May, and we confirmed a very important finding. The major political actors in Egypt are more likely to link to Facebook or YouTube or Twitter than they are to each other. So these Western media sites, including some journalism sites, the BBC, the CNN, are actually key information brokers for other important political actors in Egypt. And structurally, these social media have a very central role in passing information between actors, among actors, and feeding that information internationally. Over 20% of the 1,000 or so links going out of Egyptian political party websites were to Western social media sites, such as YouTube, Twitter, and blogging. So to answer this question of what really goes on, we need to be able to say there's important cascades of the freedom meme going across the region, and we've been able to confirm that. And we need to be able to place how centrally Facebook and YouTube were in information networks. And in the case of Egypt, we're able to demonstrate that.
Thanks very much. I actually have a follow-on question for you. So you've been looking at sort of geographic ties, it sounds like. Can you look at demographic ties as well? Can you look at age of these people or gender differences? Do you think there's a difference between the online conversation?
That's a great question. That's a great question, and it's the next step in the research to tackle it. But let me offer some hints about where we're going to go with this, and that actually concerns gender. So, what we know anecdotally is that digital media provides very important opportunities to draw women into political conversations that they're not always able to have in some of these societies. And so, I have two examples to offer by way of anecdote. The first is that we found in our research that a third of the Twitter users in Tunisia and Egypt, those we confirmed to be there, were women. It's difficult to know whether that's high or low, but most of the experts we have spoken to say that women participate much more in these online spaces in terms of talking about politics. And sometimes these are about, this kind of participation is about conversations we might not think of as overtly political. So discussions about what love means in cultures where marriages are arranged. These kinds of small p political conversations are often difficult to have face-to-face, but are being had online. The second thing is that we know anecdotally that the introduction of new computer technologies or mobile phones in the households actually changes the way resources get allocated to young girls. So several USAID studies across North Africa have found that when new technology comes to the home, often it's the eldest male, the boys, who get access to information technologies. But within a few weeks, the family conversation